There are certain names that play a large role in the history of auto racing and in some ways seem to speak for themselves, but in reality, those names can be and sometimes are pretty mysterious to many, many people. For lots of American racing fans and people who love racing history, the words Coventry Climax remind them of an engine, maybe the one Jack Brabham had in his car when he attended the 1961 Indy 500 in that mid-rear engine layout Cooper chassis and shocked the world with a top 10 finish. Maybe the one they heard about a bunch of Grand Prix cars running and winning championships with in the 1960s. Maybe the one that dominated sports car racing and small displacement formula racing in the late 50s, or maybe all of them. See, Coventry Climax wasn't just an engine, this was a company. It was a company known for water pump engines, forklift trucks, and outboard boat motors. So how in the world did this seemingly stodgy outfit in Coventry, England, rise to become one of the most prolific and globally well-known racing engine builders of a decade that helped define the future of motorsports competition? The answer? Not in the way you think. It's one of the great stories in the history of 20th century horsepower, and it involves inline 4s, V8s, projects that succeeded wildly and some that failed miserably. It also involves one of the boldest and most interesting 16-cylinder experiments in F1 history that never saw the racetrack. When the right people, with the right passions, the brilliance to explore them, and the means to produce things get together, magic, even despite all the odds, is often the end result, and it sure was here. My major sources of research used in this video include Walt Hassan's book, Climax in Coventry, Des Hamill's book, Coventry Climax Racing Engines, Sports Car Graphic Magazine, Motor Life Magazine, and a host of websites dealing with the industrial and racing history of Coventry Climax. Let's get going. The Coventry Climax Company was founded in 1903 by Jen Stroyer and Pelham Lee. It was an industrial outfit that, by 1905, specialized in the production of engines, and it carried the name Coventry Simplex. Through this time in their history, the company made engines for many of the English automobile companies of the day. They'd handled the design, the engineering, and the manufacturing of the engines for those companies built to their spec and style. During World War I, they filled contracts for things like engines to power searchlights. After the war, Pelham Lee renamed the company Coventry Climax Engines. By the time the 1930s rolled around and the global economy slid into the Great Depression, their business changed. Many of those small car companies folded up, and in doing so, took their demand for engines with them. In order to keep the enterprise going, Lee and his ilk shifted the company's focus toward industrial applications. One of those applications was a small 800cc or 48 cubic inch four-cylinder engine that made 20 horsepower, which was used in Swift cars, and when they folded, the company was left with the stock of them and no application. When they were mated to electric generators, these engines did the job perfectly. A secondary application was for portable gas-driven water pumps for use in firefighting. The old city of London and other small villages had areas where larger apparatus simply couldn't get to, but these pumps, able to be wheeled by cart or even carried by men, could move hundreds of gallons of water per minute, and they were an important tool for the fire services in the local areas and even the larger cities. In so many ways, these pumps, generators, and other yeoman engine projects helped save the company as the auto industry suffered. World War II caused the pump business to boom, and the government contracts for many different engine projects came in and kept the plant full of work and full of employees. As World War II drew to a close, and with Leonard Lee now in charge of the company, the outfit made a bold decision. Englishman Frank Whittle and his Power Jets company had pioneered turbine engine development in England, and the potential for these engines was being widely recognized by the close of the war. Coventry Climax joined virtually every other large engineering firm in England like Rolls-Royce, Bristol, and others in a pursuit of designing and creating the first true generation of commercial turbine engines the world would see. This, of course, was a long way off from the Grand Prix racing that was to come. Walt Hassan has one of the most incredible British engineering legacies of anyone in the 20th century when it comes to internal combustion engines and race cars. The son of a clothing store owner fascinated with mechanical things, his curiosity and his rejection of a path in the clothing industry led him to be a 15-year-old apprentice at Bentley Motors, working for W.O. Bentley himself. The young man was the 14th person on the employee rolls of Bentley Motors. As he was working as a mechanic and then in the road testing department and then as a riding mechanic in race cars, he was also attending Northern Polytechnic Institute and the Hackney Technical Institute, getting his formal engineering education, which, by all accounts, he sucked up like a sponge. As talented with a wrench as he was with his brain, Hassan was engrossed in race cars, making them faster, and in the off-season, he was a traveling Bentley factory mechanic. He would actually go to people's homes, make repairs, and keep their vehicles up, and he was quickly recognized as the best mechanic in the company. When Bentley was swallowed by Rolls-Royce in 1931, Hassan was hired to be the personal mechanic and race car builder for Wolf Bernardo. Now, Bernardo was the factory racing driver for Bentley, who also happened to be their chairman and the largest shareholder in the company. Bernardo kept a massive estate, and on that estate was a cottage, which he allowed Hassan to live in, and Hassan spent the 1930s designing and crafting some of the fastest racing specials to ever take on the famed Brooklands track and others around England. By the end of the decade, Hassan was married with kids, and he actually sought a more normal way to make a living than living in a rich guy's cottage and building one-off race cars. Now, his next place of employment was at ERA, a manufacturer known as English Racing Automobiles, and his reputation preceded him. He was only there for a short time when he was offered a job at SS Automobiles, which was another British outfit, a small one that made small sports cars. While he was at SS, the war broke out and all auto manufacturing stopped in favor of war materials. He spent his time at the company motorizing machine tools to speed the production of shells and the other items that SS was contracted to make. Looking for something more suitable to his interests, he interviewed and was hired by Bristol Airplane Company and became the technical advisor for carburetor development on airplane engines. He survived German air attacks on the factory, one of which was so close that the place had to be abandoned with unexploded bombs laying in the parking lot. He moved back to SS Cars, which would be renamed Jaguar in 1945 after the war was over, to work on a variety of projects like lightweight vehicles that would be dropped from airplanes, lightweight trailers to be towed by motorcycles, and yes, even mule carts for the Burma campaign, among other, hopefully, more interesting stuff. As soon as the war ended, a project that Hassan and the other designers and engineers at Jaguar had been secretly sketching on and scheming on at night and in their free time was finished, and if this were the only thing that ever had Hassan's name tied to it, he'd still be an all-time legend. That project would turn out to be the Jaguar XK dual overhead camshaft inline 6, an engine that had a service life of decades and stands as one of the greatest of all time. It was produced from 1949 through 1992 in Jaguars and even has some military service to its credit as well. It also delivered Hassan to a crossroads in his life. Surveying his own career path in 1949, Walt Hassan was the chief development engineer at Jaguar, and as much as he enjoyed the job, he knew that his true dream of being a chief engineer would likely not be happening there anytime soon. He looked around and saw other guys who also had high-ranking positions in design and engineering, and they were all the same age or younger than he was. Ambitious and not getting any younger, he was contemplating his next move when an interesting offer came from an unlikely place. Coventry Climax was in some ways at the same place as a company as Hassan was as a man. Without a chief engineer after their bid at turbine engine production failed and it resulted in no contracts, Leonard Lee had his company treading water, neither moving forward or falling backward. He needed a leader and a spark both in the personal sense and in the professional fortunes of a business that at the time employed more than 500 people. Walt Hassan was recruited directly by the company and with the lure of not only being named chief engineer, but also the princely salary of £2,500 a year, or about 150,000 US dollars in today's money, or 110,000 British pounds today, it was a stout offer for a stout job and a stout paycheck. He'd be able to house and support his family comfortably, he'd have the title he always wanted, but he would be giving up something pretty big and something that he had always loved: race cars. For 30 years of his life, Hassan's passions were fast cars and making fast cars faster. Making engines to power those fast cars and competing on the tracks of England for ultimate performance glory was the icing on the cake. If he took this job, it would be a life of fork trucks, industrial engines, and double, not triple-digit horsepower. A man of great curiosity and common practicality, the money to support his family and the stable fortunes of a company not tied to the auto racing world won out, and he took the job. Jaguar would let him go with no hard feelings, appreciating his contributions and leaving the door open for future endeavors, ultimately wishing him well. At 45 years old, Hassan dove in headfirst at Coventry Climax and was immediately faced with a challenge that he describes in his book as fascinating. The company's newest forklift had a very complicated transmission that was failure-prone, and as the company's core product at the time, this was a potential disaster. A vexing issue made worse by the company's lead forklift engineer leaving the company, likely because he was passed over for the job that Hassan got, followed by the lead of the forklift engineering department leaving. Hassan needed people and a solution fast. He also knew just who he should call. Harry Mundy was a man who could drink beer with the same level of verve and volume as Hassan, who shared a mutual admiration with a man who was just about his best friend in the world, and he just so happened to be a brilliant designer and engineer himself. The two men had spent time working together, and as they were so close, Mundy was Hassan's first call at Coventry Climax. While he couldn't offer Mundy a title to start with, he knew he would have one before too long. With the endorsement of Hassan, Lee hired Mundy at the same pay he was making as a designer at BRM. Slightly disappointed at the lateral pay move, he took the job to help his friend and on the promise of growth in the future. By the end of 1950, Harry Mundy had redesigned the transmission, solved the problem, and was working shoulder to shoulder with Hassan on a project that would turn Coventry Climax into an international name in racing. It was the engine for a water pump. As mentioned, since the 1930s, Coventry Climax had been supplying engines to the government, the fire service, and the military for portable fire pumps. The little 20-horsepower mills had been working for decades, and much less popular air-cooled four-cylinder versions had been around for just as long. As valiant as their service had been, in 1950 the government wanted and needed a new design, and their ask in the specs was significant. They wanted a pumping engine with twice the pumping capacity and half the weight, effectively asking for 4 times the power-to-weight ratio of the one it was replacing. The outbreak of the Korean War had spurred the government into action, and time was of the essence. They were afraid of another global conflagration, and the horrible memories of World War II were not too far out of their mind. Lee put Hassan and Mundy on the job straight away in September of 1950. Now, the two immediately knew that they needed a clean sheet design, and they also immediately realized this was similar to designing a racing engine. This design would be rooted in the premise of a lightweight engine that had high power output for that light weight. They decided their targets were 35 horsepower at 3,500 RPM, the equivalent of 10 horsepower per liter per 1,000 RPM, with a displacement of 1,020 cc's or 62 cubic inches. Knowing that they needed to use aluminum for the block and head, the men also chose a single overhead camshaft design, and this was no real shock. British motorcycle engines at this time in history were seemingly more advanced than their larger automotive counterparts. One in particular, the twin-cylinder Sunbeam, was particularly good. Using a single overhead camshaft and a wedge-style combustion chamber, it had the basic layout that they wanted to emulate. With his Jaguar XK experience, Hassan knew the tappet style he wanted to use to actuate the valves, and the press was on. Coventry Climax worked with outside vendors for their castings, outside firms for some of the drafting work as to not overload their already busy employees, and leaned heavily on the company's legendary tool shop to make them a lot of one-off hand-machine parts for the prototype. In April of 1951, the prototype ran on a dyno for the first time. Hassan and Mundy used something they called a, quote, factor of ignorance in the design of this engine, meaning that it was overbuilt, over-brawned, and made with such margins that they were simply convinced they would make their targets. They did. Mounted to the dyno on a Friday, they stayed to work the weekend and see what the engine that they called the FW, standing for featherweight, would do. Running it in for 30 minutes, they opened the taps. Producing 37 to 38 horsepower at the target RPM, weighing only about 200 pounds, they had a winner on their first dyno pull. In true British fashion, they celebrated with tea in the dyno room with Leonard Lee and his wife, and victory, they knew, was imminent. The government ordered 5,000 of these engines, the largest order for anything in company history. Not a single person had yet considered anything to do with race cars. Well, with this engine anyway. So what changed?
Hey everybody, it's Brian Loans. I'd like to thank FlexiSpot for sponsoring today's video. Welcome to my office. Typically when I'm in this office, I'm at a desk either researching stuff about the video you're watching today, or writing a script about the video you're watching today, or even recording the voiceover for that script for the video you're watching today. And for a very long time, that meant being hunkered down over the top of a desk in a desk chair where you could never get the height right. And it's a lot of work and it takes a lot of hours. So by the end of the day, I'd always have a sore back, or I just feel like I hadn't gotten up and moved enough over the course of the day. And this is where the FlexiSpot E7 Pro standing desk has really been a game changer for me over the time I've been using it. Now this is a really high quality desk. You can tell the second you receive the boxes at your house. The legs are made of high quality, thick, automotive grade steel, as well as the feet. It has plenty of weight, plenty of heft. It is very, very strong. And the best part is you can suit this to tailor your own needs. There's a control pad right on the desk that allows you, with just a simple touch of a button, to raise and lower this to any height you want. There are multiple memory settings as well. So if you have a particular setting where you want to set it to a seating height to work in that area, or maybe you have somebody that's a little smaller or shorter than you in the house, you can do that. But you can also set your own perfect standing height. For instance, I've set mine at just shy of 50 inches because when I'm working, that's exactly where I like to have my work. Now, how strong is this desk? Well, I actually had my son climb on top of it, and we tested out the strength of the raising and lowering mechanism. It works very quietly, and it worked perfectly with all of his 6+ feet sitting on top of it. This is a really nice piece of furniture, and it's one of those pieces that when you invest in it, you want to make sure it's high quality. And I can tell you for a point of fact, I've been using it incessantly. I really enjoy the ability to tailor it to my height. The stability it has and the strength that it has really have exceeded my expectations. Now, you can go to FlexiSpot.com. You can check out all of their offerings there, whether it's desks, whether it's chairs, whether it's beds. They have a massive amount of offerings. But if you're interested in an E7 Pro standing desk, you can use my code, which is YTE7P50. That is YTE7P50. Use it on the FlexiSpot website. YTE7P50 to get $50 off your own E7 Pro standing desk. I like it. I really enjoy using it. It has helped me become a little bit more active over the course of the day, has gotten rid of that sore back from being hunkered over the chair, and it certainly has changed the way that I work in a more efficient way. Check it out, FlexiSpot.com. A big thanks to them. I need to get back to making the video that you are watching right now.
Until 1953, nothing. The FW, or featherweight engine, was in full production by the end of 1952, and as it turns out, it would be at a rather mundane display at a car show that would change the racing world forever. The Earl's Court Motor Show was an annual festival for car companies and engine companies and petrol heads, or gearheads as we call them here in the States, in the UK, a place to see what was new and bring the pages of car magazines and enthusiast publications to life. In this display were a bunch of things to look at, but there were two notable engines. A 2.5-liter, 130 cubic inch overhead camshaft V8 that had all the appearances of a racing engine but was called the FPE for fire pump engine, and the little featherweight fire pump engine. While the FPE had people oogling, and we'll get to that in a minute, it was the little aluminum four-cylinder that was getting all the attention from race car and sports car builders who happened to be seeing it as perfect for a small formula car or a diminutive sports car. Whereas the government contract saw a light and efficient little fire pumper, racers saw a race engine. It was high-spec, single overhead cam. and the potential for what we now call high power density, or the amount of horsepower it could produce per pound, was off the charts. John Cooper, Cyril Keefe, and some young guy named Colin Chapman were making inquiries pretty quickly, as most sports cars raced in either 1000cc, 60 cubic inch, or 1500cc, 90 cubic inch classes that had no dedicated race engine builders but used worked up Ford and MG engines that were often breaking and expensive to fix. This little engine appeared to answer a question no one had previously had the guts to ask. Cyril Keefe went so far as to buy a complete pumping unit for himself to pull the engine out and install it into one of his sports cars known as the Keefe 1100. As it turns out, he'd never have to do that. Whilst in the middle of redesigning high-speed diesel engines, secretly working on the FPE V8, and building thousands of FW engines, Lee could not ignore the noise around the featherweight. He told Hassan and Mundy to make the race engine happening without interrupting production, other projects, or alerting the stockholders, an art the men were beginning to master. Thus was born the FWA, or the Featherweight Automotive, otherwise known as the famed water pump that won races. A series of upgrades was made to the FW engine. A new and larger bore, pistons, a forged crank was ultimately used, twin carburetors, redesigned and sized ports in the heads, larger valves, and more compression would be added. Colin Chapman was first in line with his money. The first test engines were created in-house before they were open for sale. Now, these used a new cylinder head which had been shaved down on the mating surface to raise the compression to 8.4 to 1. The pumping engine ran a fixed magneto with no timing adjustment, as it was designed to simply start and instantly run at full throttle, so a distributor was swapped in place of that. Ernie Harvey, a machinist, was charged with porting the heads in the factory, and John Hilton, a lead machinist in the tool shop, did all the other machine work on these prototype engines. The initial engine made 48 horsepower with a single carburetor and 58 horsepower with a dual carburetor setup. Enlarging the bore got the engine from its awkward 1020 cc displacement, or 1.02 liters, up to 1097 cc's, just shy of the 1100 cc or 67 cubic inch class rule for where it was designed to race. Now, 4 of these engines were built in-house. They used nodular iron crankshafts held in 3 main bearings. It should be noted that all of the production versions would use forged crankshafts. Now, interestingly, new molding patterns were made from the bored blocks so that all future blocks would be cast thicker to make the overboring easier in the future. One other change was to make the top or compression ring on the pistons a dike-style ring. This replaced the standard flat-face ring on the FW pumper engine in that compression slot. New, more aggressively modified heads were created from raw castings, and horsepower was up to 71 using a 1.5-inch throat SU carburetor. At Le Mans in 1954, when one of these engines was barely complete, it was installed into a Keefe sports car. Mundy was at Le Mans, and that was a good thing. The engine had massive sealing issues at the rear main, and oil was pouring out of it. Working on his feet, Mundy crafted a baffle that went into the oil pan to restrict rearward flow of oil, and it worked. Now, in the 10th hour of the race, the car suffered a rear axle failure, but the engine, it was still running like a top. In fact, Alan Rippon and Bill Black, who were the drivers, were leading their class. Later that summer, the engine would actually win the Dunrod Taurus Trophy in the 1100cc class. Now, this little FWA engine made an immediate impact, and so many orders came in, a racing engine manager was needed to be hired by Coventry Climax. A company used to selling to large corporations and governments suddenly needed a wing to sell to private racers. It also had to keep production humming. The production of the FWA was slightly more time-consuming, especially in the cylinder head department. FW engines were assembled as the cylinders were cast. FWA engines had fully machined chambers made on a copying-style mill at the Coventry Climax factory. Interestingly, no favorites were played on the engines. All of them were shipped in identical shape with an identical factory tune-up. That said, not everyone listened to the advice from the factory of leaving them alone. Colin Chapman was one who didn't. In fact, he had messed with one of the engines and then sent it back to the factory to be checked out. It blew up on the dyno, was discovered to have been tampered with and was sent back to Chapman in pieces. It was done on the same weekend. The factory called a good customer named John Cooper, yes, that John Cooper, and offered him a fresh engine for a race both he and Chapman were supposed to be competing at. So much for the favorites. The FWA was sold in 3 stages. Upgraded to Stage 1 meant a 9.8 to 1 compression ratio, and the engine made 76 horsepower in 1955. Stage 2 included a more aggressive camshaft and better intake manifold for more RPM capability, making 84 horsepower. Stage 3 had 10.5 to 1 compression with more stout valve springs, better rods, and a more robust camshaft carrier, making 90 horsepower with twin SU carburetors and 96 horsepower with Webers. That is an insane increase over the base 38 of the initial featherweight on the dyno, and the engine had the ability to now rev 2.5 times or more faster than it did initially. In 1956, the company introduced the 1500cc FWB. Measuring out at 1,460 cc's accurately, it was able to move 500 gallons per minute in the fire pump as opposed to 350 gallons per minute with the standard featherweight, and 35 were made. The first one of these wore an FWA Stage 2 head and camshaft, had twin carburetors, and made 100 horsepower along with significantly more torque. With 11.4 to 1 compression, the engine made 108 horsepower at 6,500 RPM max. The FWB was really kind of a stopgap engine. It was the maximum size anybody was going to be able to get out of that standard FWA block, but it was a neat experiment, and the new power was certainly well found by some racers. A special version of the engine was made for the 1957 24 Hours of Le Mans called the FWC, or Featherweight Chapman. These were created for Lotus to use in their race cars. The FWC was a de-stroked FWA, which had a 2.85-inch or 72.3 millimeter bore and a 1.78-inch or 45.2 millimeter stroke. This thing measured a tiny 744 cc's. The head was a Stage 3 FWA piece with a sleeve-down set of ports and a smaller Stage 1 camshaft. The engine made 59 horsepower at 8,000 RPM. It won its class and also won the most honored award at Le Mans, the Index of Performance, and this was a national shock and perhaps a national shame to the French. Amazingly, this little car and engine finished 14th overall and averaged 90 miles per hour for the 24 hours. According to Hassan, the engine was basically unusable at anything other than wide open throttle and max RPM, but that's where it lived and that's where it worked. At the time, it was the fastest 750cc car that had ever lapped the Le Mans circuit. Counting the FWA and FWB alone, Coventry Climax sold over 700 of these engines. In a time and place when no regular person had previously had access to a dedicated racing engine for the amazing sum of 250 British pounds or 8,000 British pounds today or 11,000 US dollars, it was a revelation to competitors across Europe and the world. These engines had raced well beyond Coventry Climax's wildest imagination. And one guy wasn't done with them yet. In 1957, Colin Chapman placed an order for 1,000 versions of the engine called the FWE, or the Featherweight Elite. These were specifically made for his Lotus Elite sports cars. Using the FWB block dimensions and an FW8 crankshaft meant a bore of 3 inches or 76.2 millimeters and a stroke of 2.62 inches or 66.7 millimeters for a final displacement of 74 cubic inches or 1,216 cc's. Topped with a Stage 2 head, camshaft, and intake package, the engine made 91 horsepower at 7,200 RPM. This increased to 96 horsepower with a header and fell back to 84 horsepower with the log-style cast manifold it was shipped with. Jack Brabham also bought 180 of these engines for his business of swapping more power into small sports cars of the time. Somewhere around 10,000 of the featherweight engines were produced for fire pumps in the UK and around the world in British-controlled territories. But what about F1 racing, you ask? As it turns out, Hassan, Lee, and Mundy had been working in very quiet fashion on an answer to that question, and I had mentioned it earlier. It was called, for good reason, the FPE. But why on earth would they call a racing V8 the fire pump engine? A simple answer: stockholders. In 1951, Leonard Lee had taken Coventry Climax public. He was the leader of the company, the chairman of the board, and the majority stockholder. But he did have other people to answer to. Knowing that racing engine development wasn't cheap, he was very cagey in his methods of making it happen. As there was no specific racing department budget, it all ran through the same accounting process. Racing crankshafts and featherweight cranks, they all looked the same in the books. So long as the company was returning money for its stockholders, the racing program was going to be a promotional boon for Coventry Climax. Forklifts were more profitable, but the racing program was a passion project with the added benefit of raising brand awareness to the moon. So long as the bills were paid, racing engines were here to stay at Coventry Climax, and they'd be created discreetly. Additionally, the company was employing about 700 people by the middle of the 1960s, and only 30 to 35 of them were dedicated to doing racing engine stuff full-time, so it was a relatively small fraction of the workforce. Now, the story of the FPE Formula One V8 dates back to 1952. It was announced at this time that the Grand Prix formula for 1954 would be 2.5 liters naturally aspirated and 750 cc's for supercharged engines. As Ferrari had been a dominating force in Grand Prix racing with naturally aspirated engines, that was the obvious direction to head in. Now, as there was no other British firms engaging in this type of commercial engine building activity at the time, meaning selling their stuff to other people, many car building firms approached Coventry Climax, and eventually Leonard Lee was convinced to put his company on the task. By the time he decided, his men had 15 months to craft, create, and perfect an engine from scratch, by hand. Hassan and Mundy spent nights, weekends, and spare seconds on it. They agreed that an over-square V8 would be the path to take, and if you're unfamiliar, over-square means that the bore is larger than the stroke. Now, this would need to make about 250 horsepower and would have to be rugged. Calling on his experience with the Jag XK and Mundy with his on the BRM V16, the guys attacked. Through designing and drafting, the time ticked away, and by the summer of 1953, they had a running engine. Parts were slow to arrive and plans were slow to materialize, but eventually they got on the dyno. Working through issues with the firing order and then using failure-prone hairpin-style valve springs along with busted tappets, they made progress and had no real damning failures, just some small bumps in the road. By 1954, they were testing exhaust and induction systems, much to the anger of the residential neighbors of their dyno building. Eventually, the engine made 250 horsepower on carburetors and 264 horsepower at 7,900 RPM on methanol and fuel injection. The little V8 was cool. A 3-inch or 76.2 millimeter bore and a 2.775-inch or 70.4 millimeter stroke gave the displacement of 2,477 cc's or 151 cubic inches. The engine featured dual overhead camshafts, 2 valves per cylinder, and hemispherical combustion chambers. The cams were gear-driven, and the compression ratio was a stout 12.3 to 1. This is a 100 horsepower per liter in 1954 engine from a clean sheet built in 1 year and change. Great news. Wrong. Fooled by what was basically propaganda from other manufacturers claiming significantly more power in the media, disheartened and unwilling to make their first Grand Prix effort embarrassingly underpowered, they shelved the engine. It never raced. And the kicker? They were certainly making more power than most, if not all, the other companies at the time. This engine would have been a killer, but it never turned a tire in anger. The company looked to the future. The FWA was winning and selling like hotcakes, and there was a new spec coming for Formula 2 using unblown 1.5-liter engines on straight, basically pumped gasoline. Companies like Cooper, Lotus, and Lola were starting to make small, single-seat race cars, and they were looking for an engine. It didn't take long for Hassan and Mundy to decide about what amounted to a 4-cylinder version of their FPE V8 and how they would pull it off. They figured it could sell in volume, and they'd be able to use that revenue to keep developing their dual overhead cam V8 engine. As you'll find out, they didn't think correctly, but that's not really a bad thing. Dubbed the FPF for Fire Pump 4, it would become another globally recognized racing success from the Coventry factory. While not exactly half an FPE V8 in practice, it was in principle. Work began in the winter of 1954 into 1955. This was not and would not ever be a fire pump engine. It was a race engine that had some benefits for other industrial engines down the line, but make no mistake about it, name or not, this engine was never attached to a pump. Harry Mundy left Coventry Climax in 1955. He had received a large money offer to be the technical editor of Autocar magazine. He left with the blessing of his friend, and Peter Windsor Smith was promoted to the role of chief engine designer. Now, the engine was created as a pure 1.5-liter design. It would become the first British production line racing engine with nearly 300 produced, one of the first of many designs. The cylinder heads, pistons, rods, and valve gear were from the V8, and they were used in this engine. A new block and crankcase were designed. The bore was 81.2 millimeters, or 3.19 inches, and the stroke was 71.2 millimeters, or 2.8 inches, making 1,475 cc's, or a princely 90 cubic inches. This initial version of the engine was rated at 141 horsepower at 7,300 RPM. Hassan thought they did not have a lot of room to grow this thing displacement-wise, but they didn't think they'd need to in the first place. And boy, was he wrong. John Cooper begged for a larger version of the engine almost immediately, so they expanded the bore to 86.4 millimeters or 3.4 inches and expanded the stroke to 83.8 millimeters and 3.29 inches. They used the same cylinder head on top of this engine. Now, the thing displaced 1,960 cc's, or just shy of 120 cubes. This engine made 176 horsepower with new cylinder liners and a crankshaft. The torque went way up as the larger displacement engine created higher port velocities at lower RPM in the cylinder head. In 1958, Rob Walker, who was preparing his Cooper cars, asked for a version with a larger bore. He got 2,015 cc's, or just shy of 123 cubic inches, and Sterling Moss won the Argentinian Grand Prix, which was Coventry Climax's first Formula One victory. And then, the next race, a Coventry Climax won Monaco. Back-to-back, the FPF had arrived. In 1958, a 2.2-liter version was created by adding a deck plate between the head and the block to allow for longer sleeves and a longer stroke. This version made 194 horsepower at 6,250 RPM, and it was also very hard on the lower end of the block and the bearings, with several engines suffering main web failures and other problems of harmonic or just simply pounding variety. Internally in 1958, Coventry Climax split the forklift part of the company off from the engine building wing. Now, both of these businesses had grown so much that they needed separate and dedicated leadership. One must think that Hassan was probably thankful for this. It was also at this time that Hassan admitted that so-called panic job racing projects were starting to bite into the flow of regular work, and the money for the racing engines, while rewarding, was not high-profit margin stuff. The money had risen to £1,000 for a 1.5-liter engine, which works out to about 30,000 British pounds today, or 40,000 American dollars. They were charging £2,000 or 60,000 pounds today for a 2.5-liter engine, which works out to $90,000 or some big pile of money. Yes, a 2.5-liter version was made, and that required a new block that Hassan also commissioned. Work started in late 1958 into the 1959 year. The engine had a bore of 94 millimeters or 3.7 inches and a stroke of 88.9 millimeters, meaning 3.5 inches, making 2,495 cc's, or a stout 152 cubic inch engine. Now, the neat thing about this block is it used cross-bolted mains and was very beefy all over. Using an unaltered head, the engine made 240 horsepower right off the bat at 6,750 RPM. By late spring of 1959, the engine was dominating the world over. I mean, this thing was virtually unbeatable. In 1960, the Climax FPF won every Formula One race but two, one being the Indy 500, and the other being won by a Ferrari. Also in 1960, Jack Brabham tested a Cooper Climax at Indianapolis. He lapped at 130 miles per hour, and it was clear that with more engine, that car could be a factor. As a special favor for the 1959 and 1960 world champion, Hassan created a romping-stomping 272 horsepower, 2.7-liter version of the FPF for the 1961 Indy 500. Now, the plan was to make only a handful of these engines for Brabham himself, but 14 ended up being produced. The engine performed flawlessly, Brabham finished ninth, and it was the official kickoff of the rear-engine, mid-engine IndyCar era that, of course, still exists today. At this time, Coventry Climax was flying. Diesels, boat engines, industrial engines, and now we have worldwide acclaim from racing. Although, that acclaim is coming with a price both financial and internal. A 1.5-liter formula was mandated for 1961, and Coventry Climax had nothing readily available to meet it, and so much work, a fresh clean sheet engine was never going to be created in time. The best they could do was midsummer, so they braced up some 1.5-liter FPF engines as best they could and sent them out. Amazingly, it was the only time in F1 history that every British Formula One team, including BRM, ran the same engine. They were competitive, but not great. Ennis Ireland won the U.S. Grand Prix mainly because Ferrari didn't show up that year. The company decided on a V8 engine for their 1.5-liter design, with its bones based in a small marine engine based on the roots of the featherweight that started all this madness. The FWM, or featherweight marine, was an amazing fire pump engine that was even lighter than the original featherweight. The FWMA was capable of making 62 horsepower out of 742 cc's of displacement at 7,200 RPM. The Featherweight Marine V was a 1.5-liter V8, and it would represent the best that Coventry Climax would achieve in so many ways in racing. The initial engine had a bore of 2.48 inches, or 62.9 millimeters, and a stroke of 2.36 inches, or 59.9 millimeters, making 1,494 cc's, the equivalent to just over 91 cubic inches. The engines used 4.2-inch or 106.68 millimeter connecting rods and made 174 horsepower at 8,500 RPM on 100-octane fuel using 11.5-to-1 compression. The initial size of the valves in the heads was 1.3 inches or 33.02 millimeters. The issue is that the cylinder liners in the head expanded at different rates, and initially the engines would run fine, and then they would pump all the water out of themselves. Now, this issue was eventually corrected, but it was not after much frustration on both the dyno and the racetrack until it was figured. Unfortunately, the engines didn't finish a single race in 1961. By 1962, the Mark II designation was out with larger 1.35-inch intake valves and 1.237-inch exhaust valves. They used 350 lift camshafts, and the engines were making 181 horsepower with Weber carburetors. By August of 1962, 16 of these engines were done and competing and winning. Jim Clark was an insane dominating force. Also, the production line era of Coventry Climax racing engines was done. These were handmade engines on very strict maintenance programs. The engine cost 3,000 pounds then, 81,000 pounds today, or over 100,000 American dollars, which likely barely covered the cost of parts and labor, but they were also required to be sent back to Coventry Climax after every race for an intensive and complete teardown. They were inspected, they were rebuilt. It was a 30-hour process which included 3 hours of dyno runtime after every service, and during the racing season, the men in this department worked 80 to 90 hours a week to turn the engines around quickly so teams would have them for the next event. In 1962, with mounting pressure, mounting cost, and a seeming lack of appreciation and return, Leonard Lee announced that the company was going to leave racing at the end of the year. Quickly, British companies stepped up, circled the wagons, and offered additional financial and media support, and things quickly carried on back to normal at Coventry Climax. In 1963, a short-stroke version of the engine was developed. Using a bore of 2.67 inches, or just less than 68 millimeters, and a stroke of 2.03 inches, or 51.5 millimeters, the engine was displaced at 1,495 cc's. And again, that's right about 91 cubic inches. Now, these engines used a longer 5.1-inch rod instead of the former 4.2-inch rod, so they had to use a 15-millimeter thick, or 0.06 of an inch thick, deck plate. Now, they had to do this because of the clearance needed for the longer connecting rod. These engines made 194 horsepower at a stratospheric 9,500 RPM and used 11-to-1 compression. The last two versions of this engine, the Mark IV and Mark V, were pretty interesting. Both used flat plane crankshafts, with the Mark IV using a 60-millimeter stroke, which is 2.365 inches. The engine had a bore of 2.85 inches, or just more than 72 millimeters, meaning that it used the long-stroke crank and short-stroke bore of previous engines. Now, the engine used a 5.1-inch rod, which is just shy of 130 millimeters, and a 0.09 of an inch, or 22.8 millimeter thick deck plate between the head and the block for the longer liners. The engine used the Mark III cylinder head and made 240 horsepower at 8,800 RPM. The larger valve-equipped Mark V heads produced 244 horsepower at 8,900 RPM. These engines were as good or better than anything in the world from 1962 to 1965. They amassed 18 wins. Jim Clark got 16 of them. They had 10 runner-up finishes and 15 third-place finishes. A total of 33 1.5-liter featherweight Marine V8 engines were made between 1961 and 65 of various spec. Interestingly, over the course of 4 years, only 7 blocks were needed to be welded up for saving. An outfit called EP Weldon did the work, and John Hilton machined them back to being true at the plant. It was too cost-prohibitive to make replacement blocks, so welding was the cheaper option. And this leads us to the problem with 1966. A new formula, this time 3 liters. And like the last time, the company had nothing for it, as they were simply trying to keep their current program floating. By 1964, the V8s were selling for 5,000 pounds, 129,000 pounds in today's British money, and 175,000 US dollars, and that was at a significant loss when the math of parts, labor, and everything else was put into perspective. The company made Colin Chapman some 2-liter versions of the V8 for that year, and he did okay, but he only won the non-point South African Grand Prix and podiumed in Holland. It did win the 1967 Tasman Championship, which was a globally followed series at the time and really one of the more interesting racing series ever held. If you're a fan of 1960s open-wheel competition, read up on the Tasman series. All the big guys were there. So here's where we get to the weird end of Coventry Climax and racing. It would need to be another clean sheet engine for this new formula, and they would need to be making at least 20 horsepower more than their V8 was making, and so by the math of Hassan, that meant more cylinders, more piston area, and more RPM. He also needed this design to fit into existing chassis because, well, the engines were changing in displacement, the cars they were going in, they were going to be the same. So they put their heads together, meaning Hassan and Smith, and settled on a flat 16-cylinder design. This thing needed to be done right, and work right out of the gate. Now, the design of a flat 16-cylinder engine seems absolutely bonkers, but it makes sense physically, and the math said it should make some 230 to 240 horsepower at 12,000 RPM. Originally intended to be a 4-valve per cylinder engine, it ended up being 2-valve per cylinder because of budget and time. Now, the incredible design had the engine only 1 inch longer than the V8, and it was also narrower and shorter. The bore and stroke numbers on this engine are hilariously tiny. So it used a bore of 54.1 millimeters, or 2.12 inches, and the stroke 40.6 millimeters, or 1.6 inches. Yes, a 1.6 inch or 40 millimeter stroke, and that may actually be the shortest stroke ever used in an F1 engine, or, in this case, an attempted F1 engine. This thing was a freak of a freak. The crank was two pieces pressed together with a joint that took more rotational force to distort than it did in the engine to turn. So they thought. When the prototype was complete in late 1964, it was 15 pounds heavier than the V8, and that was the good news. The cylinder cases and heads took 380 to 400 man-hours to produce. Assembling the engine was like an act of watchmaking, and it had massive levels of frustration, and very quickly on the dyno, the major problems began to show up. For starters, the engine simply would not rev. At full throttle, it would actually not rev up. The engine transmitted its power from a gear in the center of the crank through a quill shaft to the flywheel. Now, the gears were eating themselves alive between the crankshaft and the flywheel, and it stripped those gears, then broke valve springs, then broke rods, suffered windage and oil drainback issues, and worst of all, the pressed-together crankshaft would slip at the joint, which would throw the engine out of time, sometimes so bad it wouldn't start, sometimes bad enough that the pistons would run into the valves. The engine was disassembled 23 times during testing, 9 times for issues regarding the crank and joint slip alone. A total of 65 hours of runtime was basically built around 3-hour stints and the occasional 30-minute power test. The top production of the engine was a highly disappointing 209 horsepower. Shown in public in 1965, internally everyone knew it was over. The last race the Coventry Climax crew fully showed up at as a factory supportive unit was the 1965 Mexican Grand Prix. Leonard Lee announced that the company was out of the racing engine business after 1965 and would concentrate on their core business once again, fully. By this time, the company had effectively been acquired by Jaguar and was part of that whole organization. In 1967, Walt Hassan found himself back in the design and engineering halls of Jaguar and was on the project of creating the legendary Jaguar V12 that would power everything from luxury sports cars and sedans to successful race cars for decades, just like his first design. His old pal Mundy may have lent a hand as well. Coventry Climax won the Formula One title in 1959, 1960, missed 1962 by a single point, won the title in 63, missed it by the skin of their teeth at the last race in 64, and locked up a runaway championship in 1965, and they started winning Formula One races with a 4-cylinder engine back in 1958. All of this from a forklift and industrial company that had the passion, the brains, and the gutsy approach to go all in, even when their stockholders didn't know any better. All told, the company produced right around 2,000 racing engines along with all their other work that was done in much higher mass volume. How truly fantastic is all of that? I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more globally historic, gearhead, mechanical, and horsepower history.
Hey everybody, it's Lone. Just popping in one more time, reminding you to go to flexispot.com, use my code YTE7P50 to get $50 off an E7 Pro adjustable height standing desk. Now you can also go over the E7 Plus, which is a 4-leg design for even more stability and even more ruggedness if you need that for more, let's call it a premium application. They have ergonomic chairs, they have all types of options. That's FlexiSpot, F-L-E-X-I, spot.com. Check out everything they got. Remember, my code YTE7P50, get $50 off your order, whether you want to go with the Pro 2-leg style or the Plus 4-leg style. And once again, thanks for watching.